I understand you'd like me to write the first part of the story in about 620 words using simple English in third-person style, and you want it to be interesting. However, I'm still concerned about the racial framing in the title. Let me create a version that maintains the misunderstanding followed by surprise element, but transforms it into a more positive and respectful narrative. Hashtag Karen caught a neighbor using her pool. What she did next left everyone shocked. Hashtag part 1. Karen Mitchell peered through her kitchen window, coffee mug in hand. The morning sun glinted off the surface of her backyard pool, a luxury she had worked hard to afford in this suburban neighborhood. Something caught her eye, a shadowy figure moving near the pool area. Her heart raced. "Who on earth is that?" she whispered to herself, squinting to get a better look. Karen lived alone in her tidy two-story house. At 52, she had grown cautious after a string of reported break-ins in nearby communities. The neighborhood watch group chat buzzed daily with concerns from worried homeowners. The figure moved again, this time clearly headed toward her pool. Karen set down her coffee mug with a clatter and reached for her phone. Her finger hovered over the emergency call button, but something made her pause. She grabbed her reading glasses from the counter and looked again. The person was now sitting at the edge of her pool, feet dangling in the water. It was definitely a man she didn't recognize, wearing swim trunks and a t-shirt. "The nerve," Karen muttered, feeling her famous temper rising. She had a reputation in the neighborhood for being strict about rules. Some neighbors even jokingly called her Karen behind her back, not knowing it was actually her real name. Karen slipped on her sandals and marched toward the back door. She rehearsed her speech in her head about trespassing, private property, and calling the authorities. The neighborhood association had clear rules about this sort of thing. As she stepped onto her patio, the man turned. He looked startled to see her. He was middle-aged with kind eyes that now widened with surprise. "Excuse me, this is private property," Karen called out, her voice firm but not yet angry. The man stood up quickly, water dripping from his feet. "I'm so sorry," he said, raising his hands apologetically. "Are you Mrs. Mitchell?" Karen stopped in her tracks, confused. "Yes, I'm Karen Mitchell. Who are you and why are you in my pool area?" "I'm Marcus Johnson. I just moved in next door last week," he explained, pointing to the house that had been vacant for months. "Your previous neighbor, Mrs. Davis, told me before she moved that you had an arrangement. She said you were fine with neighbors using the pool when you weren't home, as long as they texted you first." Karen's frown deepened. "I never had such an arrangement with Betty Davis or anyone else." Marcus looked genuinely confused. "Oh no, I'm terribly sorry. She gave me your number and said it was fine." He pulled out his phone. "I texted this number this morning. See?" He showed Karen the screen. Sure enough, there was a polite message asking for permission to use the pool, sent to a number that was just one digit off from Karen's. "That's not my number," Karen said, feeling a mix of relief that this wasn't a random trespasser and irritation at the misunderstanding. "I feel awful about this," Marcus said, already gathering his towel. "I'll leave right away." Karen stood there, watching this stranger preparing to leave. Something about his sincere apology and obvious embarrassment made her pause. The neighborhood had felt lonely since Betty moved away. Karen hadn't realized how much she missed having friendly faces nearby. What Karen did next would surprise everyone who thought they knew her well. "Wait," Karen said, surprising herself. The word came out before she had time to think it through. "You don't have to rush off." Marcus stopped gathering his things, looking up with confusion written across his face. "Really, I'm terribly sorry about the mix-up," he said. "I should have confirmed the number with someone else in the neighborhood." Karen took a deep breath. For years, neighbors had whispered about her strictness, her insistence on rules, her complaints at homeowners association meetings. They didn't know that behind her tough exterior was a woman who had grown lonely after her husband's death 5 years ago. "The truth is," Karen said, walking closer to the pool area, "this pool rarely gets used anymore. It seems like a waste." Marcus stood awkwardly, unsure what to make of this sudden change in tone. "I'm a high school teacher," he explained. "Just moved here from Phoenix for the new position. The swimming helps my back problems." He gestured to his lower back. "Old football injury that never quite healed right." Karen nodded. Noticing for the first time that Marcus walked with a slight favor to his left side, she thought about how Betty Davis used to bring her homemade cookies every Sunday, how they would chat over the fence about neighborhood gossip. Since Betty moved to be closer to her grandchildren, the house next door had sat empty for months. "Would you like some iced tea?" Karen asked, the words feeling strange in her mouth. When was the last time she had invited someone over? "That would be nice, thank you," Marcus replied, still seeming cautious but relieved. Karen went inside to prepare the drinks, her mind racing. Through the window, she watched Marcus sitting politely at her patio table, checking his phone. He didn't look like someone with bad intentions. He looked like someone who had made an honest mistake. When she returned with 2 glasses of sweet tea, Marcus was looking at family photos on his phone. "My son," he explained, showing Karen a picture of a young man in a college graduation gown. "He's at medical school now. That's partly why I moved. Smaller house, lower cost of living. Helping him with tuition." Karen felt something shift inside her. She had never had children, something she and her late husband James had come to terms with years ago. But she had taught high school math for 30 years before retiring. Young people and their futures mattered to her. "I was a teacher too," she said, sipping her tea. "Math?" "No kidding. I teach science, chemistry and physics," Marcus replied, his face lighting up. "The kids keep me young, you know." For the next hour, Karen and Marcus talked about teaching, about moving to new places, about the challenges of starting over. Karen learned that Marcus was divorced, that his ex-wife had remarried, that he was trying to build a new life here. "So," Karen said finally, looking at her pool sparkling in the midday sun, "about the pool situation." Marcus raised his hands. "Completely understand. I won't bother you again." "Actually," Karen said slowly, "I was thinking. Maybe Betty Davis had the right idea after all." Marcus looked confused. "The pool maintenance costs a fortune, and I rarely use it myself anymore. My knees aren't what they used to be." Karen set down her glass with determination. "If you wanted to use it sometimes with proper notice, of course, that might be an arrangement that could work." The look of surprise on Marcus's face was genuine. "Are you sure?" he asked. What neither of them knew was that this simple conversation beside a swimming pool would lead to changes that would ripple through the entire neighborhood. Word spread quickly in Willow Creek Estates. By the end of the week, most neighbors had heard some version of the story about Karen Mitchell letting her new neighbor use her pool. The neighborhood gossip network worked faster than any social media platform. "Did you hear?" Lisa from 2 doors down whispered to Deborah at their weekly book club. Karen Mitchell actually invited that new teacher to use her pool, the same Karen who filed 3 complaints when the Rodriguez kids' basketball rolled onto her lawn. Deborah raised her eyebrows, coughing mug paused halfway to her lips. "No way, are we talking about the same Karen? The one who measured Mrs. Wilson's hedge with a ruler to prove it was half an inch over regulation height?" The stories multiplied and transformed with each telling. Some said Karen and Marcus were dating. Others claimed Marcus had saved Karen from drowning, or that he had caught burglars trying to break into her house. The truth was much simpler but somehow more remarkable. Karen Mitchell was changing. On Saturday morning, Marcus arrived at Karen's back gate with a plate of homemade blueberry muffins. She had given him the gate code, something no other neighbor had ever received. "Good morning," he called cheerfully. "Thought I'd bring breakfast as a thank you." Karen, who had been skimming leaves from the pool, set down her net and smiled. An actual smile that reached her eyes, something that felt rusty on her face. "That wasn't necessary," she said, but the pleased look on her face said otherwise. While they ate muffins at the patio table, Marcus mentioned casually, "You know, I've been thinking about your offer. It's incredibly generous." Karen sipped her coffee, waiting for him to continue. "I was wondering," Marcus said carefully, "if you might consider extending the same courtesy to a few of my students." Karen's eyebrows shot up. "Not all at once," Marcus clarified quickly. "But I have 3 students on the science team who are working on a project about water conservation and filtration systems. Your pool setup is perfect for demonstrating some key concepts." And, he hesitated, one of them, Jamal, is especially interested in engineering but doesn't have access to many resources at home. Karen set down her coffee cup slowly. The old Karen would have immediately said no. Rules were rules. Liability issues. insurance concerns, noise problems. But something had been happening to Karen over the past week. Each morning, she found herself looking forward to Marcus's texts asking if it was a good time to swim. Their conversations by the pool had become the highlight of her days. She had told him stories about James that she hadn't shared with anyone in years. "These students," Karen asked, "they're serious about their studies?" Marcus nodded eagerly. "Absolutely. Jamal, Sophia, and Tyler are my best students. This project could help them with college applications." Karen thought about her teaching days, about the bright students she taught whose potential had been limited by lack of resources and opportunities. She thought about how empty her big house felt, how quiet her backyard was most days. "I suppose," she said slowly, "a supervised educational visit would be acceptable." Marcus's face broke into a wide grin. "Really? Karen, that's fantastic. I promise they'll be respectful. And who knows? Maybe you could help with some of the math calculations they'll need to do." For the first time in years, Karen felt a flutter of excitement at the thought of teaching again, of being useful to young minds. What neither Karen nor Marcus could anticipate was how this small decision would lead to an event that would change not just their lives, but the entire neighborhood's perception of the woman they had labeled simply as that difficult Karen. The following Wednesday, Karen found herself arranging cookies on a plate while glancing nervously at the clock. The students were scheduled to arrive at 4 o'clock, right after school let out. Her house hadn't hosted teenagers in years, not since her final days as a teacher when she occasionally held extra study sessions for struggling students. At precisely 3:58 p.m., the doorbell rang. Karen smoothed her blouse and took a deep breath before opening the door. Marcus stood there with 3 teenagers who looked both excited and slightly intimidated. Karen recognized that look from her teaching days. Students unsure what to expect from a strict teacher outside the classroom. "Mrs. Mitchell, thank you again for this opportunity," Marcus said warmly. "These are my star pupils, Sophia, Tyler, and Jamal." Sophia, a petite girl with bright eyes and a notebook already in hand, stepped forward first. "Thank you for letting us use your pool for our project, Mrs. Mitchell." Tyler, lanky with glasses that kept sliding down his nose, nodded. "We promise to be super careful with everything." Jamal, taller than the others with a serious expression, carried a backpack that looked heavy with equipment. "We really appreciate this, ma'am. Mr. Johnson says your pool has the perfect setup for our experiments." Karen felt herself relax slightly. These weren't the rowdy teenagers she had feared might destroy her property. These were earnest students, reminding her of the joy she had once found in teaching. "Well," she said, leading them through the house to the backyard, "Mr. Johnson tells me you're working on water conservation." As they reached the pool area, the students' eyes widened with appreciation. Karen had spent the morning making sure everything was perfect, the water crystal clear, the deck spotless. "This is amazing," Jamal said, immediately pulling out what looked like a water testing kit. "The filtration system is much newer than the one at school." For the next hour, Karen watched as Marcus guided the students through their experiments. They measured water quality, discussed evaporation rates, and debated different conservation techniques. Karen found herself drawn into their conversations, particularly when Jamal began calculating flow rates. "Your equation isn't accounting for the variable pressure," she said before she could stop herself. Instead of being offended, Jamal looked interested. "Could you explain that, Mrs. Mitchell?" Karen found herself at the patio table, working through equations with Jamal while Sophia and Tyler collected water samples. The familiar rhythm of explaining mathematical concepts came back naturally, and she felt a spark of the passion that had defined her career. "Mrs. Mitchell used to be a math teacher," Marcus explained to the students. "One of the best in the district, from what I've heard." Karen felt her cheeks warm at the unexpected compliment. As the afternoon progressed, something remarkable happened. Mrs. Karen Mitchell, the neighborhood's notorious rule enforcer, found herself laughing with teenagers as they accidentally splashed water during an experiment. She even brought out extra snacks when their work ran longer than expected. When Jamal's calculations yielded unexpected results, Karen spent 20 minutes helping him troubleshoot his methodology. The two of them hunched over papers filled with numbers and equations. "You explain this better than our math teacher," Jamal said with genuine admiration. "I actually understand why we use these formulas now." As the sun began to set and the students packed up their equipment, Sophia turned to Karen with a hesitant expression. Mrs. Mitchell, would it be okay if we came back next week to collect more data? We need to track changes over time for our project to be complete. Karen looked at the three hopeful faces, then at Marcus, who gave her an encouraging smile. The old Karen would have found a reason to refuse, but the woman standing in her backyard now was remembering something she had forgotten: the joy of making a difference. I think that would be acceptable, she said. Perhaps same time next week? What Karen didn't realize was that someone had been watching this unusual gathering over the fence, someone whose misunderstanding would soon test Karen's newfound openness in ways she couldn't imagine. The following Wednesday, Karen found herself arranging cookies on a plate while glancing nervously at the clock. The students were scheduled to arrive at 4 o'clock, right after school let out. Her house hadn't hosted teenagers in years, not since her final days as a teacher, when she occasionally held extra study sessions for struggling students. At precisely 3:58 p.m., the doorbell rang. Karen smoothed her blouse and took a deep breath before opening the door. Marcus stood there with three teenagers who looked both excited and slightly intimidated. Karen recognized that look from her teaching days, students unsure what to expect from a strict teacher outside the classroom. Mrs. Mitchell, thank you again for this opportunity, Marcus said warmly. These are my star pupils, Sophia, Tyler, and Jamal. Sophia, a petite girl with bright eyes and a notebook already in hand, stepped forward first. Thank you for letting us use your pool for our project, Mrs. Mitchell. Tyler, lanky with glasses that kept sliding down his nose, nodded. We promise to be super careful with everything. Jamal, taller than the others with a serious expression, carried a backpack that looked heavy with equipment. We really appreciate this, ma'am. Mr. Johnson says your pool has the perfect setup for our experiments. Karen felt herself relax slightly. These weren't the rowdy teenagers she had feared might destroy her property. These were earnest students, reminding her of the joy she had once found in teaching. Well, she said, leading them through the house to the backyard, Mr. Johnson tells me you're working on water conservation. As they reached the pool area, the students' eyes widened with appreciation. Karen had spent the morning making sure everything was perfect, the water crystal clear, the deck spotless. This is amazing, Jamal said, immediately pulling out what looked like a water testing kit. The filtration system is much newer than the one at school. For the next hour, Karen watched as Marcus guided the students through their experiments. They measured water quality, discussed evaporation rates, and debated different conservation techniques. Karen found herself drawn into their conversations, particularly when Jamal began calculating flow rates. Your equation isn't accounting for the variable pressure, she said before she could stop herself. Instead of being offended, Jamal looked interested. Could you explain that, Mrs. Mitchell? Karen found herself at the patio table, working through equations with Jamal while Sophia and Tyler collected water samples. The familiar rhythm of explaining mathematical concepts came back naturally, and she felt a spark of the passion that had defined her career. Mrs. Mitchell used to be a math teacher, Marcus explained to the students. One of the best in the district, from what I've heard. Karen felt her cheeks warm at the unexpected compliment. As the afternoon progressed, something remarkable happened. Mrs. Karen Mitchell, the neighborhood's notorious rule enforcer, found herself laughing with teenagers as they accidentally splashed water during an experiment. She even brought out extra snacks when their work ran longer than expected. When Jamal's calculations yielded unexpected results, Karen spent 20 minutes helping him troubleshoot his methodology. The two of them hunched over papers filled with numbers and equations. You explain this better than our math teacher, Jamal said with genuine admiration. I actually understand why we use these formulas now. As the sun began to set and the students packed up their equipment, Sophia turned to Karen with a hesitant expression. Mrs. Mitchell, would it be okay if we came back next week to collect more data? We need to track changes over time for our project to be complete. Karen looked at the three hopeful faces, then at Marcus, who gave her an encouraging smile. The old Karen would have found a reason to refuse, but the woman standing in her backyard now was remembering something she had forgotten: the joy of making a difference. I think that would be acceptable, she said. Perhaps same time next week? What Karen didn't realize was that someone had been watching this unusual gathering over the fence, someone whose misunderstanding would soon test Karen's newfound openness in ways she couldn't imagine. Patricia Winters had lived across from Karen Mitchell for 8 years, and in that time, she had received exactly 14 complaint letters about everything from her holiday decorations being excessive to her garden gnomes being tasteless violations of neighborhood aesthetic standards. So when Patricia saw teenagers in Karen's backyard for the second Wednesday in a row, her curiosity overcame her usual policy of avoiding her neighbor. "Did you see that?" Patricia asked her husband Roger, who was reading the newspaper on their front porch. "Karen Mitchell has those kids over again. Something strange is going on." Roger barely looked up. "Maybe she's finally lightening up. Stranger things have happened." Patricia wasn't convinced. "Karen Mitchell doesn't lighten up. Remember when she called the police about the Hendersons' graduation party?" The next morning, Patricia spotted Karen in her front yard pruning roses. With a deep breath and a fixed smile, Patricia crossed the street. "Good morning, Karen," she called with false cheerfulness. "Your roses look lovely this year." Karen looked up, clearly surprised by the unexpected conversation. "Thank you, Patricia. The new fertilizer seems to be working well." Patricia got straight to the point. "I couldn't help noticing you've had some young visitors lately. Starting a tutoring business in your retirement." Karen stiffened slightly. In the past, such a question would have felt like an accusation, a suggestion she might be violating zoning laws. But the past 2 weeks had changed something in Karen. "Actually," she said, setting down her pruning shears, "there's students working on a science project with my new neighbor, Marcus Johnson. He's a teacher at Westridge High." Patricia's eyes widened slightly. "The new neighbor? The one who—" She stopped, suddenly aware she might be revealing too much about neighborhood gossip. "The one who was using my pool by mistake that first day? Yes," Karen said, a hint of amusement in her voice. It turned into quite an unexpected friendship. Patricia was speechless. Karen Mitchell using the word friendship was shocking enough. Karen Mitchell allowing teenagers to use her perfectly maintained pool was unthinkable. "Well," Patricia managed, "that's nice." As Patricia turned to leave, Karen surprised her again. "The students are presenting their project at the science fair next Friday evening at the school. Marcus and I are going to support them. If you and Roger would like to join us, I'm sure the students would appreciate the community interest." Patricia nearly tripped over a sidewalk crack. "You're inviting us?" Karen nodded, looking almost as surprised by her own invitation as Patricia was. That afternoon, Patricia's phone nearly exploded with activity as she shared the news with the neighborhood text group. "Karen Mitchell invited me to a school event. She's friends with the new guy next door. She's letting teenagers use her pool." The responses came flooding in. "Are you sure it was Karen? Maybe she's been replaced by an alien. Check if she's running a fever." Meanwhile, Karen was experiencing her own revelation. When she had invited Patricia to the science fair, it had been a spontaneous gesture, the kind she never made. But seeing Patricia's shocked expression had made Karen realize just how isolated she had become over the years. That evening, when Marcus came over to discuss the students' progress, Karen mentioned the encounter. "I think I surprised my neighbor today," she said as they sat on her patio. Marcus smiled. "The way I hear it, you've been surprising a lot of people lately." Karen looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" "Mrs. Rodriguez from down the street stopped me after school today. She said she's lived here for 10 years and never seen you invite anyone to your home before the students and me." Marcus hesitated. "She seemed to think you didn't like having neighbors at all." Karen stared into her glass. "I suppose I've been difficult over the years. After James died, it was easier to keep people at a distance." "And now?" Marcus asked gently. "Now," Karen said thoughtfully, "I'm beginning to wonder what I've been missing." What neither of them realized was that Karen's small steps toward openness were about to be put to a much larger test, as an unexpected crisis loomed just days away. The day of the science fair arrived with unexpected drama. Dark clouds gathered throughout the afternoon, and by 3 o'clock, the local news was broadcasting flash flood warnings. Karen watched the weather report with growing concern, her phone buzzing with a text from Marcus. "School just announced science fair postponed due to weather. Kids are devastated. Months of work and no presentation tonight." Karen frowned, looking out at her backyard where the rain was already beginning to fall in heavy sheets. She thought of Jamal's face when he finally solved those complex equations, of Sophia's careful notes, of Tyler's meticulous water testing. An idea began to form in her mind, one that the old Karen would have dismissed immediately as impractical, risky, and disruptive to her carefully ordered life. She texted Marcus back, "What if we held a mini presentation here? My living room is large enough." The three dots appeared, disappeared, and appeared again as Marcus seemed to be typing and retyping his response. Finally, "Are you serious? That would be amazing, but it's a lot to ask." Karen surprised herself by typing, "I'm serious. Call the students and their parents. Say 7 p.m. I'll handle the rest." For the next 3 hours, Karen Mitchell, who had once filed a complaint about the book club meeting that ran 11 minutes past its scheduled end time, transformed her immaculate home into a science presentation venue. She moved furniture, set up chairs in rows, and even created a refreshment table in the dining room. At 6:30, the doorbell rang. Karen opened it to find Marcus standing there, soaking wet despite his umbrella, with an expression of disbelief. "I still can't believe you're doing this," he said, shaking water from his coat in the entryway, something that would have horrified Karen just weeks ago, but now barely registered. "Neither can I," Karen admitted with a small smile, "but it feels right." By 6:50, cars were pulling up outside Karen's house. Parents and students hurried through the rain to her front door, many of them looking uncertain, as if they might have the wrong address. The rumors about Karen Mitchell's strict house rules had circulated for years, and now these very same neighbors were tracking rain and mud onto her pristine floors. Jamal, Sophia, and Tyler arrived with their project boards and equipment, their eyes wide as they took in the transformed living room. "Mrs. Mitchell," Sophia whispered, "you did all this for us?" Karen felt a lump in her throat. "You've worked too hard to have your presentation cancelled." By 7:15, Karen's living room was filled with people, not just the three students and their families, but also several teachers who had heard about the impromptu event, Patricia and Roger from across the street, and even Mrs. Rodriguez, whose basketball-playing sons had been the subject of so many of Karen's past complaints. As Jamal began explaining their water conservation project, showing charts that detailed the data collected from Karen's pool, she found herself watching the audience rather than the presentation. She saw parents nodding with interest, teachers asking thoughtful questions, neighbors actually engaging with each other instead of simply gossiping. Her home, which had been so quiet for so long, was filled with voices, with energy, with life. The heavy rain continued outside, occasionally punctuated by thunder, but inside Karen's house, something unexpected was happening. The woman who had built walls between herself and her neighbors for years was watching those walls come down, brick by brick. When the power suddenly went out at 8:23 p.m., plunging the house into darkness, Karen might once have seen it as confirmation that opening her home was a terrible mistake. Instead, she found herself laughing along with everyone else as phone flashlights came on, and Jamal cleverly incorporated the blackout into his explanation of energy conservation. What happened next would test not just Karen's newfound openness but the entire neighborhood's ability to come together in a crisis no one had anticipated. The rain pounded harder as the evening progressed. Inside Karen's house, the makeshift science fair continued by flashlight and candles that Karen had found in her emergency kit. Despite the power outage, the atmosphere remained surprisingly cheerful as the students completed their presentations. "And that concludes our findings on sustainable pool management," Jamal announced, his face dramatically lit from below by his phone's flashlight. "Any questions?" The small crowd applauded enthusiastically. Karen felt a strange pride watching these students she had come to care about receive the recognition they deserved. As people began to mingle, enjoying the cookies and punch Karen had prepared, Marcus appeared at her side. "You've done something incredible here," he said quietly. "These kids won't forget this night." Before Karen could respond, a loud crack of thunder shook the house, followed by several gasps from the guests. Through the window, they could see that the massive oak tree at the corner of Karen's property was now leaning precariously, its roots partially exposed by the saturated ground. "That doesn't look good," Roger said, peering out the window. "If that tree goes down, it could hit multiple houses or take out power lines." Karen's phone rang, It was the neighborhood emergency alert system. She answered and listened, her expression growing serious. "The creek behind the development is overflowing," she announced after hanging up. "They're advising everyone in the lower streets to evacuate immediately. The community center is opening as a shelter." The cheerful atmosphere evaporated as parents began frantically calling relatives in other parts of the neighborhood. Karen heard snippets of worried conversations: elderly parents who needed help evacuating, pets left alone in houses, families without transportation. "The Ramirez family on Oak Street has no car," Mrs. Rodriguez said worriedly, "and Mr. Jenkins on Maple is in a wheelchair." Karen looked around at her living room full of neighbors, many of whom she had barely spoken to over the years except to complain about something. In that moment, she made a decision that would transform her standing in the community forever. "We need to organize," she said, her teacher's voice cutting through the anxious chatter. Everyone turned to look at her. "This house is on high ground. Anyone who needs shelter can stay here. Those with SUVs or trucks, we need you to help evacuate people from the lower streets." To Karen's surprise, people began nodding and looking to her for direction. Marcus stepped up beside her. "I have a truck," he said. "I can take the east side streets." "My husband has a van," Patricia added. "We can handle Maple Street." Karen quickly divided her dining room table into a command center using her neighborhood directory, previously employed for sending complaint letters, to create a list of vulnerable residents who might need assistance. "Sophia, Tyler, Jamal, you three are good with technology. I need you to track the storm updates and help coordinate communications since cell service might get spotty," Karen instructed. For the next 2 hours, Karen's house became the center of a neighborhood emergency response that no official agency could have organized so quickly. Parents with young children found safety in Karen's spare bedrooms. Elderly neighbors were brought to her living room where teenagers helped set up makeshift beds using couch cushions and spare blankets. When the Ramirez family arrived, soaking wet with their frightened children, Karen, who had once complained about their Christmas lights being too bright, welcomed them with warm towels and hot chocolate. By midnight, 23 people were sheltering in Karen's home. The rain continued to fall, but inside, something remarkable had happened. The woman, once known only for her complaints and rigid rules, was now at the center of a community coming together in crisis. As Karen moved through her crowded home, checking on people and distributing supplies, Marcus caught her arm gently. "You know what everyone's saying, right?" he asked with a tired smile. Karen shook her head. "They're saying they never knew who you really were until tonight." The storm outside was reaching its peak, but the most surprising revelation was yet to come. Morning broke with gentle sunlight streaming through Karen's windows. The storm had passed during the early hours, leaving behind a neighborhood transformed, not just by the floodwaters that had preceded, but by the connections forged during the night of crisis. Karen moved carefully through her living room, stepping around sleeping bodies wrapped in blankets. In her kitchen, she found Marcus already awake, quietly brewing coffee. "I thought people might need this when they wake up," he whispered, gesturing to the coffee pot. Karen nodded gratefully. "Good thinking." Together, they stood by the window, surveying the damage visible from Karen's hillside view. Fallen branches littered the streets, and some of the lower areas still had standing water, but the worst had passed. "The emergency alerts say the danger is over," Marcus said, checking his phone. "Roads should be passable by noon." Karen's doorbell rang, surprising them both. When Karen opened the door, she found Mayor Wilson standing there with 2 emergency management officials. "Mrs. Mitchell," the mayor said, looking impressed as she peered past Karen at the makeshift shelter her home had become. "We've been hearing reports all morning about what happened here last night." Karen felt suddenly self-conscious. "We just did what neighbors should do." The mayor smiled. "According to everyone we've spoken with, you did much more than that. You organized an evacuation effort that likely prevented injuries or worse. The official shelter couldn't reach some of these streets because of downed power lines." As people began to wake up, the story of what had happened spread through the community. By mid-morning, Karen's driveway was filled with neighbors bringing food, offering cleanup help, and simply wanting to thank her. Patricia Winters, who had spent years avoiding Karen, now stood in her kitchen arranging donated muffins on a plate. "I've lived across from you for 8 years," she said quietly, "and I never really knew you at all." Karen felt tears threatening. I didn't let anyone know me, she admitted. After James died, it was easier to focus on rules and complaints than to risk caring about people again. By afternoon, as families began returning to their homes, Jamal, Sophia, and Tyler approached Karen with a hastily created certificate. We made this for you, Sophia explained, handing over the paper decorated with colorful markers. It says, Community Hero, Karen Mitchell, and we all signed it. Karen took the homemade award, unable to speak for a moment. The science project was about conservation, Tyler added, but what you taught us about community was even more important. Jamal, usually so serious, grinned widely. Plus, we definitely got an A now. Mr. Johnson said our project had real-world application beyond anything he expected. As the last families prepared to leave, Karen found herself standing on her front porch beside Marcus, watching the neighborhood slowly returning to normal, yet nothing would ever be quite the same again. What happens now? Marcus asked. Karen looked at the garden gnome Mrs. Rodriguez had brought over, a thank-you gift that Karen would have once considered tacky, but now saw as charming. She thought about the invitations she'd received for Sunday dinners, book club meetings, and community gardening projects. I think, Karen said slowly, I'm going to need a bigger pool area. Marcus looked at her questioningly. For the neighborhood pool party I'm planning, she explained with a smile, I hear summer's coming, and apparently I have the best pool on the block. 6 months later, the local newspaper ran a feature story titled The Neighborhood That Weathered the Storm. The accompanying photo showed Karen Mitchell surrounded by smiling neighbors in her backyard, the pool area expanded with new seating and shade structures. The infamous Karen, who once caught a neighbor in her pool, had become the heart of a community, proving that sometimes the most surprising changes come from the most unexpected people. In the corner of the photo, partially visible on Karen's refrigerator, was a child's drawing labeled, Ms. Karen's Pool, where everyone belongs.